Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
Good morning, my friends. 3 a.m. Central Time in Oklahoma. Just couldn't sleep. When you tell people online you have trouble sleeping from time to time, everybody's got their remedy, and it's interesting that different remedies work for different people. Melatonin for some, weed for others, reading before bedtime, not reading before bedtime. Some people refuse to use their cell phone. Some people do, but they have the blue light filter on their phones. Everybody's got their own little thing that they do. A few times a year, I'll hit a wall where I'm an insomniac. And it's not that I feel bad. It's just that I have, I think, what the Buddhists called monkey mind. You know, your brain is just all the time, and you have a hard time shutting off, and you lie there, and you sort of look around and go, well, I can either lie here longer, or I can get up and go do something productive, which for me usually means a bowl of Rice Krispies. So I figured I'd just pinball through a few of the things that have been happening, some of the things that have appeared on my timeline. I saw this article that was published by Today. It says, America is in a sex drought. Oh, wait a minute. Of all the problems that you and I face here in this world, we now have a sex drought. The article, the subtitle says, we don't have to have sex to be happy, but sexual intimacy is associated with healthy relationships and overall well-being. Well, I mean, on top of the fact that we've got real problems when it comes to the current administration, the theocrats, people blaming video games for the most heinous of human acts. I'll put the listener line up on screen in case anybody wants to dial in at this unholy hour and sound off on the sex drought. Is it drought or drought? Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Drought or drought? We're having a drought or a drought? I think drought. Back to the article. Published this year in April by Megan Holohan. Since about 2012, researchers have noticed somewhat of an unusual trend in the United States. Fewer Americans are having sex than they did in previous decades. Now, I can already hear my good friends from across the pond going, good, the fewer Americans we have procreating, the better. Yeah, just be nice, be kind, all right? I mean, the fact that you're watching this stream tells you that not all Americans deserve that kind of talk. You know, there's a lot of good people in this country, and there's a lot to love about this country. Back to the article. We're seeing pretty marked increases in the share of people who are not having sex frequently, especially in the share of younger adults. Brad Wilcox. I'm sorry, his name is W. Bradford Wilcox. Well, that's a good reason he's not having sex right there. He's director of the National Marriage Project, University of Virginia. He told Today, we've come to a day that's about 50 years after the sexual revolution, and what we're seeing is a decline of sex among young adults. No one, including myself, could have predicted this. A recent story in the Washington Post crunched the numbers from the General Social Survey conducted by NORC at the University of Chicago about what it called the Great American Sex Drought. And notice that 23% of adults admitted to not having sex in the past year. 23%. That's 1 in 4. What's more, young men, especially those who are living at home and not working, are driving this trend. The economic issues are real and significant. Christine Whalen, Director of Money Relationships and Equality Initiative in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, told Today, increasingly, what both men and women are looking for is a good financial prospect. All right. We have a sex drought in the United States. People are just not getting it on these days. 1 in 4 under the age of, 30? 1 in 4 say that they have not had sex in the past year. I have a hard time believing this number. And then you ask the question, how do you qualify sex? How do you define sex? Because independent sex, like the masturbatory conversation, must take place. Is that sex? Like sex with yourself? Because I have a feeling if someone is not having sex with someone else, they're getting creative on their own. These are questions. I have questions. And they're talking about the economic challenges relating to a sex recession. I mean, I haven't really considered this. Just the kind of shit that pops up on my social media stream, and I stop and I read the article and go, hey, wait a minute. What else was on my little pea brain today? I got to officiate a secular wedding. This was interesting. I have been invited to be a secular officiant on several occasions, and I have not done so. It's just fallen through. It's not that I wasn't excited about the opportunity. But somebody said, hey, we want to do a ceremony. We don't want it to be religious. We don't want a preacher. We know that you're a communicator. We'd like you to come and officiate our wedding. And I was going to do one in California, and it fell through, and there was another one, and it fell through, and there was another one, and they just didn't happen. Well, there was one in my hometown. There was not one mention of God in the in the ceremony, rather. We just made it about the couple. I got a chance to sort of engage the crowd just a little bit. It was a brief ceremony in a near 100-degree heat at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And how much fun it was to be able to go out and connect these two people in this way. Yes, being a secular officiant is a thing. And, then you get into discussions about the value and the virtue of marriage. And, people are like, well, marriage is obsolete and monogamy is obsolete. And, I think just stop, because these two get to decide how they want to define their relationship. Yeah, they were a family long before they tied the knot, I think. Natalie and I lived together for years and years before we ever got married, and we just hit our 5th anniversary on the 1st of August. But we get to decide. So we were a family then, we're a family now, but we wanted to frame the relationship with a marital union. And so we get to make that choice. And it doesn't mean that your union is any less or more valid because you do or do not get married. It's just kind of, we're all about letting people live their own lives and do things the way they want. So I got the opportunity to be a part of this memory. And it was cool. I was a little bit nervous. Public speaking is something I do a lot of. And so it wasn't that portion of it. It's, when people ask me what I do, who's coming to the wedding? Like who's going to be there? Are they religious? Some religious people, when they find out, do they know there's a secular officiant? Are they expecting prayers and the unity candle and the altar and dedicating everything to God? And the ring is the symbol. It has no beginning and no end, like the love of our Father for us, those types of things. And there was a little bit of that. I think I ran into a few religious relatives, but largely, it was just awesome. And I'm honored to have been a part of that. And I want to thank the couple and the family and everyone involved for giving me the opportunity to be a part of that memory. I'm an ordained dudist priest, I guess, the Church of the Latter-day Dude. If you're familiar with the Big Lebowski, I wrote about the Church of the Latter-day Dude in my book, Sacred Cows. But I do have my certificate of ordination from the Church of the Latter-day Dude. I was actually an ordained monk just as a lark. You can send in to this, I forget what the name of the website was. I should have looked it up. I didn't realize I was going to be talking as much about it. But you can send something in and you can become an ordained monk, and then you can remain ordained as long as you send in your yearly vows and you type in some yearly vow, or you click yes on a vow and you send it in, and then you get to be an actual ordained monk. And this just shows you some of the insanity of what the qualifications are to be quote unquote clergy in our society. And I just thought it was funny. I'm going to be a monk, an ordained monk. Didn't renew my vows, so that lapsed years ago, and I kind of regret it. I kind of enjoyed being able to say, well, I'm an ordained monk. While everybody else is talking about their mission trips to Guatemala to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, I'm like, well, I'm just a monk. I'm just an ordained monk. What else was going on? Oh, we're talking video games. Do you see this? This is a shot. It's September 1st, 1939, colorized Hitler playing his first video games that caused him to be violent and start World War II. And then you have Hitler playing with his Xbox controller. Now, the reason this meme exists, and it's been flying all around the internet, once again, after all of the horrible headlines that we're seeing, we have Scapegoat City out there. We have people who are telling us that it's video games. Screw the gun, screw the conversations about the weapons themselves, screw the conversations even about mental health, etc. Now, let's talk about video games. Did you see the article that said that Wal-Mart has now banned violent imagery in its stores, meaning that it's not going to show Call of Duty posters with fighting going on? That's now illegal, or it's against policy at Walmart, but it's perfectly fine for them to sell weapons in their hunting and sporting goods department. So the imagery is a problem, but the weapons themselves are just fine. It's against our policy to show a video game depicting violence, but you can actually buy the weapon that will kill someone in fact, stop by, because we have a special going on in our sporting goods department. I just thought that was an interesting thing. So here you have Hitler. He's playing his Xbox right before he carries out the atrocities of the Holocaust of World War II. And there are memes going around all over the place as people demonstrating the absurdity of this entire thing. PBS NewsHour had an article, Why It's Time to Stop Blaming Video Games for Real-World Violence. This was published by Chris Ferguson at NPR. No, I'm sorry, at PBS in their science section. This came out just a few days ago. In the wake of the El Paso shooting August 3rd that left 21 dead and dozens injured, a familiar trope has reemerged. Often when a young man's the shooter, people try to blame the tragedy on violent video games and other forms of media. This time around, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick placed some of the blame on the video game industry that teaches young people to kill. Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy of California went on to condemn video games that dehumanize individuals as a problem for future generations. And President Trump pointed to society's glorification of violence, including gruesome and grisly video games. These are the same connections a Florida lawmaker made after the Parkland shooting February 2018, suggesting that the gunman in that case was prepared to pick off students like it's a video game. But the author of the article says, speaking as a researcher who studied violent video games for almost 15 years, I can state there's no evidence to support these claims that violent media and real-world violence are connected. As far back as 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that research did not find a clear connection between violent video games and aggressive behavior. Criminologists who study mass shootings specifically refer to these sorts of connections as a, quote, myth. And in 2017, the Media Psychology and Technology Division of the American Psychological Association released a statement I helped craft, suggesting reporters and policymakers cease linking mass shootings to violent media given the lack of evidence for a link. And then it launches off into a section about moral panic. Now, this interests me. We're always looking for the scapegoat. I'm reminded of what we had learned about prohibition, right? Alcohol, vice. There used to be a play that they showed here in my hometown of Tulsa. They may still show it. It's an old Prohibition era play called The Drunkard. And in the play, you had a guy who wrestled with vice, and that vice was alcohol. And the fact that he had succumbed to the temptation of drinking alcohol caused pretty much all the other problems in his life. Now, I'm not minimizing the damage that can be done by the overuse of alcohol. I mean, we've all seen alcoholism, and we know that there are some issues with it. But they were blaming everything, all these things on vice, and they were also punishing those who were using alcohol responsibly. And then by having prohibition in place, which made alcohol illegal, they're throwing it out, they're smashing the bottles, they're making it all absolutely illegal with these massive arrests. They, they weren't actually causing people to not drink. They were causing people to become more creative in how they drink. So then you get the speakeasies, which were these little bars that were hidden away among polite society. Speakeasy, you would go in and you would utter a password, or you would see a symbol somewhere and you could sneak into the speakeasy and have your drink. People find a way. And of course, prohibition didn't work. It was repealed. I'm reminded back in the 1950s, Elvis Presley, right? It was Elvis's pelvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. They refused to show him on TV from the waist down because the gyrating pelvis was supposedly going to lead to the moral decay of society. Rock and roll music in general, a scapegoat for all of society's ills. If it's wrong with us, it's because of these young children and their rock and roll music. And what else has been a scapegoat for that kind of stuff? Pinball machines were considered part of the moral decline of society. There was a time when they actually went and destroyed a bunch of old pinball machines because they felt like it was harming people. Video games fit into that. The satanic panic is a wonderful example of people desperate for a scapegoat. They look around and see Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games and those evil dice being rolled. Well, those are responsible for the decay of society and opening the spirit world. The portals to hell are now wide open. The devil can now come tap an entire generation on the shoulder. And we have to do away with Dungeons and Dragons or Ozzy Osbourne or the Smurfs or, just pick it. Just pick it. People are always looking around, making these sort of emotional decisions, deciding in their own minds or in their own hearts is probably more accurate that, well, it's this. And it has something to do with their own fears, their own insecurities about society, their own ignorance of how the brain works, ignorance of we think about video games themselves. Here in the United States, we have citizens. How many citizens we have? 360 million people live in this country. 166 million people play video games of some kind. 160 plus million people in this country play video games, and more than 40% of those are in some way a shooter game. If this moral panic was rooted in reality, it would be a bloodbath. There'd be rivers of blood. You'd have to crawl to your vehicle in the prone position. You would not be able to exist, to be able to live without body armor out there. It'd be the Wild West. It'd be Thunderdome. It would be Escape from New York. The idea that 166 million times 40% playing shooters are now being prompted to become shooters. That's ridiculous. I need to throw a caveat out. There is, as I understand it, according to the science, some evidence supporting the claim that people who have violent tendencies already, those prone to such behavior, triggered is not the word, but they might be negatively influenced by a video game. That is a referendum on the mindset of the person themselves, not on the games, in my opinion. If someone is more prone to be violent when they are drunk on alcohol, it is not a referendum on all of alcohol. And you don't punish the law-abiding. You don't punish the people who are using it responsibly, who are ineffective. You don't gauge the whole by the anomaly. And I think the same is true for any quote-unquote vice. I think video games themselves, if you look at Japan and South Korea, they have a higher per capita usage of video games than the United States, and yet we are the ones who have all the mass shootings. Not Japan, not South Korea. And so there's a tremendous number of holes in this theory. And we are creatures of science and reason and the evidence. And so I think it's an interesting conversation to have, to talk about video games and violence, and to talk in a broader way about moral panic, about how people just lose their shit, and how video games have always been the scapegoat that people like to use when it comes to trying to fix the world. You take away video games, how does that even look? What does it look like to decide that violent video games? Who decides what level of violence? What constitutes violence? What type of violence? Then how is it regulated in the world of the internet, where people are writing their own code and there's a plethora of games that people can use and alter? It's like a 3D printer. People can print their own stuff these days. They can decide they want it, and they can make it, and they can distribute it on their own terms, and you can pass laws against it. But this cat's out of the bag. So even if it was tethered to reality, how do you police it? How do you police it? To me, it's just crazy. I do actually have some callers on the switchboard. Let's see, 815. You're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. Who's this?
Hey, Seth. Good to hear you. This is Joe from Chicago. How are you?
I'm well. Chicago, that's the stomping ground of the cognitive dissonance guys. That's awesome. So what's going on in your world, my friend?
Well, I just want to make a quick point that I think is very one to keep in our minds as we're moving forward through all this, is that you see people like Trump making this accusation that the violent video games are causing so much problems with society and our collective morality. But you have to understand that generation, they're so far detached from the culture that it's hard for them to understand. So facts, statistics don't play any role in that decision for them. It's just purely gut reaction. So I think it's very important for us all who grow up with this kind of culture and this media to understand, as we grow up and our gap widens from the next generation, to be cognizant of how we see the accusations from that previous gap, how they accuse us of things. So always keep things in mind. When you hear someone from your generation as you're moving forward, think critically, examine, be skeptical, and try to look at facts and statistics just as much as we do versus things that they put on us.
I was talking to somebody who was aghast. I mean, we're all heartbroken over the freaking insanity of our daily headlines. And, when someone says, well, it's these violent video games, it's the culture, and you say, can you source that for me? Can you back that up? I mean, is there any data supporting what you're saying about video games? And most of the responses that I hear are a variation of, well, just look around. Like, you can tell they haven't actually vetted the content of what they're trying to say. It's really more of a desperate clinging to, it's an emotional response. I'm not trying to diminish what they're feeling, but I am saying that it's not necessarily tethered to any data. Have you run into that?
Exactly. It's exactly the same. And I'll hear it even from my own parents, who they're in their 60s. They're not quite up to Trump's age, but they're definitely skeptical as well when I try to point out to them that it isn't the case, that what they've heard is just absolute fact by fiat, that it came from the president or whomever else wants to put the liability on video games. Have they not thought about airsoft rifling or paintball gunning, which is, I would argue, far more close to the real thing? But I wouldn't say that those people are going out actually committing crimes. They're just enjoying their free time in any way that any free American would choose to do so. And it's just so stupid to put all the onus on one small facet of our culture, which statistically does not lead to that conclusion. Especially considering video games are they not the number one media or the number one entertainment source in the world at this point, above TV and movies? So
I know they generate more revenue than all of the film industry, and it just blows my mind. Yeah. Well, I mean, you speak wisdom, my friend. You are Yoda. So thanks for calling and sounding off.
Happy to share. Always good to see you.
Take it easy. All right, let's take a real short break. When I come back, it's more about video games and violence. Your calls, your perspectives in just a second. Hang on. Bibimbap. It's a Korean dish that has got rice and vegetables and meat in it. I tried it for the first time a few years ago at a Korean restaurant. I cooked it for the first time last year, thanks to HelloFresh, one of my favorites on the menu. And I think it's just fun to attempt with my Oklahoma accent, Bibimbap. That's just awesome. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit delivery service with easy, seasonal recipes and pre-measured ingredients delivered right to your door. No trips to the grocery store, no food waste. You just cook and enjoy. And HelloFresh really mixes things up with a huge variety of 17 seasonal, chef-curated recipes offered every single week, delivered on the day of the week that you choose. Only about a half hour to prepare in your own kitchen. And whether you pick the family recipes or the calorie smart offerings or the vegetarian meals, the food's delicious. HelloFresh has made it fun to make and even more enjoyable to eat. From presto pesto panko chicken to the melty Monterey Jack burgers to, of course, Bibimbap. You're going to love it. For $80 off your first month of HelloFresh, go to HelloFresh.com/SethAndrews80 and enter SethAndrews80. That's 80, the number 80. That's like getting 8 meals totally free. It's $80 off your first month of HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com/SethAndrews80 and enter SethAndrews80. My beautiful, wonderful, amazing patrons get this broadcast commercial-free, and they get it a couple of days early. If you're not a patron, why aren't you a patron? You determine how much you want to support, how many shows, the dollar amount, whatever, and you can see all the details on that at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. This is a broadcast about violence and video games. What do you think? There was an article in the American Psychological Association. It's released in August of 2015. APA review confirms link between playing violent video games and aggression. Violent video game play is linked to increased aggression in players, but insufficient evidence exists about whether the link extends to criminal violence or delinquency. According to a new American Psychological Association task force report, they've seen apparently some upticks in aggression, a decrease in prosocial behavior, empathy, and the sensitivity to aggression, but this does not necessarily translate into physical aggression or violent acts. The Associated Press had an article on August 6th. Do video games trigger violent behavior? Scientific studies have found no link, but the persistent theory is back in the headlines following the mass shooting in El Paso. An online manifesto thought to be authored by the gunman briefly mentioned the combat game Call of Duty. Then President Trump weighed in, charging that gruesome and grisly video games contribute to a glorification of violence.
We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately.
Trump's statements were more reserved than during his last brush with the subject in 2018, when he called video games vicious and summoned video game executives to meet at the White House to little lasting effect. The Entertainment Software Association, the biggest video game trade group, reiterated its position that there is no causal connection between video games and violence. Quote, more than 165 million Americans enjoy video games and billions of people play video games worldwide. Yet other societies where video games are played as avidly do not contend with the tragic levels of violence that occur in the U.S. Benjamin Burrows, professor of emerging media at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, has said, certainly there is no linkage to gun violence. Burrows says that some studies show a short-term increase in aggressive thoughts and feelings after playing video games, but nothing that rises to the level of violence. Quote, plenty of gamers get upset when they lose or feel the game was cheating, but it doesn't lead to violent outputs. In 2006, a small study by Indiana University researchers found that teenagers that played violent video games showed a higher level of emotional arousal, but less activity in the parts of the brain associated with the ability to plan, control, and direct thoughts and behavior. Patrick Markey, psychology professor at Villanova University who focuses on video games, found in his research that men who commit severe acts of violence actually play violent video games less than the average male. About 20% were interested in violent video games compared with 70% of the general population. He explained in a 2017 book, Moral Combat, why the war on violent video games is wrong. There was another study by Markey and his colleagues that showed that violence tends to go down when a new violent movie or violent video game comes out, possibly because people are at home playing the game or in theaters watching the movie. The general story is people who play video games right after might be a little hopped up and jerky, but it doesn't fundamentally alter who they are, he said. It's like going to see a sad movie. It might make you cry, but it does not make you clinically depressed. That's an article from the Associated Press. I found it published in the Los Angeles Times, August 6th. No link between video games and violence, studies have shown. 903, you're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. Hi, who's this?
Hey there, Seth. My name is Samuel, and I'm also a gamer.
Yeah?
I kind of have 3 points that I kind of was discussing this with my girlfriend recently whenever we were talking about Trump trying to blame video games for all the mass shootings. So, one, I think it's a slippery slope argument because you could easily indict any other generation that's ever been subjected to violent movies. And so if you criticize violent video games, then obviously the next thing in line is going to be, whenever the mass shootings continue, it's the violent culture of people immersing themselves in Fast and Furious movies or 007 movies, you know?
Yeah.
Like, why isn't there talk about that violent subculture?
I think, too, there's a weird tie that says that people aren't able to distinguish fantasy from reality. One automatically tethers to the other. You know, I'm playing a game now called Dead Space 2, and I'm suited up in some badass. I look like a Duracell battery, and I'm walking around with, you know, a ripsaw gun and a line gun and a plasma gun, and I'm throwing bombs, and you know, these awful creatures are coming after me, and I'm blowing them, and there's body parts flying all around the screen. It's out of control. It's a very dark game.
Has Dead Space led you to want to become an astronaut?
Not an astronaut, or not a homicidal astronaut.
And yeah, and in the same way, how come we're not having the conversation about Mario games leading to turtle killings or wanting to become a plumber when you grow up?
I want to ride the dinosaur.
Yeah.
Bring me the Yoshi, and I want to go out and I want to have an adventure. And Mario made me do that. That's a great point.
Exactly.
So what are your games of choice,
Exactly.
may I ask? What are you playing these days?
Well, right now I'm playing Star Wars Battlefront a lot lately, and I'm not going to lie, that does make me want to become a Jedi.
Oh, yeah? Well,
But I don't know. I just feel like, as far as like violent video games leading to people wanting to commit mass shootings, it should much more likely be leading people to being like wanting to get shot, because most people who play shooting games die a lot more than they actually kill people.
yeah, well, in my case, I mean, my people will tell you I die horribly, repeatedly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. The cognitive dissonance, like whenever you drag these things out to their logical conclusion, the argument falls apart before it even begins. And on top of that, the people that they're referencing, like whenever they're talking about these mass shootings being a conclusion of them playing violent video games, all of the video games, especially if they're playing online, I heard this on David Pakman, one of the callers talked about it, all of their online data is logged. If they play online, it should have their hours, it should have their gamer tags, it should have exactly how much they played the video games, especially if they have a console or PC, but they won't talk about that because there's no facts to back up their arguments. It's all just assertions.
Yeah, scapegoating. Hey, man, for what it's worth, the force is strong with you. I can feel it through the radio.
I appreciate it. As with you. Thank you very much for everything you do, and thanks for letting me call in.
Yeah, it's nice talking to you. Take care. I see a lot of USA numbers, so I'm either not the only insomniac, or there are people working night shifts, or they just simply don't sleep because they are vampires. And, you know, we're atheists. That's very possible. I think we have a high vampire ratio. I mean, it's been argued, I'm sure, on Ken Ham's channel and others that we have a high vampire ratio. I was weaned on the old school console games, you know, back. I mean, I was there. I'm talking like my parents, but back when I was a child, we had Pong, and we liked it. It was Pac-Man. It was Space Invaders, Defender, Galaga. Oh, shit, what was that game with the perspective starts with a Z, where you're on the shuttle-looking ship and you're going down, you're actually going down the path. Oh, God, what's the name of that game? I can't remember. But you would go, I mean, the arcades were massive. People would go spend hours and hours and hours at the video arcade. And then the home video game revolution came to us. When Atari 2600 came, it was revolutionary at the time. I had a ColecoVision, and we played Donkey Kong. You should have seen the controllers. They were these long rectangular controllers, and they had a knob on the top, and they had a keypad on the bottom with these little twisty cords that attached actually to the console. But it was awesome. Zaxby's a chicken place. I'm sorry. Zaxby is a chicken fast food chain. I did not play Zaxby growing up. Zaxxon. Thank you. That was Qbert and all these other video games. All right, so you're playing all these games. And then bringing the video games home. I mean, they were awful at home at first, but it was just such a big deal to be able to play video games in your freaking house. And it's interesting, too, to see that the console games they're coming back as novelties, meaning that when I'm online, I'll see advertised, you can buy a console, like an actual stand-up console for your home, and it's got like 150 old school games that you can toggle through and you can play in your own house. I can't decide if I would actually use that, or I think I would prefer to play on my PC. I'm a mouse and keyboard guy. I am not an Xbox controller, PS4 controller kind of guy. Remember, the 2600 had a single joystick and a red button, one button on it. And so it's hard for me to, when you've got these buttons and 4 over here, 4 over there, and then there's 2 joysticks and 2 triggers and a button on the bottom, and then there's another one. And oh my God, it's too much. I can't deal with it. Here's one from my hometown on the switchboard 918. You're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. Who's this?
Hey, Seth. Good morning.
Hey, who's this?
This is Wilmer calling from Tulsa.
Hey, what's up? What's on your mind?
Nothing much. Just your fellow heathen, atheist, jihadist / bleeding heart liberal voter.
You a gamer?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm currently playing Wolfenstein New Order.
I'm sorry, say the name of the game for me again.
It's Wolfenstein, the New Order.
Oh, Wolfenstein, yeah. Oh my God, what an amazing game.
Tell me about it. And I also just heard you mention that you began to play Dead Space 2, and I am really envious of your circumstances because I had an incredible time diving into that story and the game dynamics, bumping up your weapons. Dude, you have a great time to look forward to.
Yeah, it's immersive, it's cinematic, it's what my wife likes to call bubblegum for the brain. Wolfenstein, it's funny, I remember playing the original and then Return to Castle Wolfenstein when it released back in the 90s. I always played the medic and multiplayer. So there'd be the Allies versus the Axis powers. And I would just be the guy running around, and if they were wounded out there in this multiplayer environment, I would go and heal them. And I always felt so good about that. I'm like, I'm a healer, man. I'm a medicine man. I'm out there helping people. I don't know if people still play Return to Castle Wolfenstein somewhere or not. Part of me'd like to go back and relive my youth. So,
Seth, I can tell you as a youngster, I mean, relatively speaking, I'm 30 years old, but as a millennial youngster, I still go back and boot up my PC and play an emulator of Doom 64, the classic Doom games, and Wolfenstein once in a while also.
Wow. Yeah. Well, someone sent me I don't know if it's what you call it, an emulator or something, but it's someone redressed to the original Quake, which was produced by id. And the graphics of the old are pretty rough, and they went through and massaged the graphics. Yes. You have to do a few tricks to it, and you can now play Quake with high def graphics, and it's pretty amazing. And you don't feel any homicidal tendencies at all. You don't feel murderous in any way. You don't feel like going out and harming people.
None whatsoever, because as many people have pointed out, that it's a pretty stupid thing to say that video games create an impulse for violence in people, when it's been mentioned repeatedly that throughout the world there's a wide market of gamers who play a range of violent video games. And in Japan, for instance, their video games are actually a lot more graphic when it comes to the content of violence and explicit sexual stories and things like that. And you don't hear about a rise in sexual assault or rape or murder, for that matter, in Japan. So why isn't that the case here? With that being said, however, the reason why I'm calling you is for me and for your fellow listeners also, to gain the benefit of your knowledge, which is to, if you happen to know, why is it that, or rather to the best of your knowledge, why is it that people always rush to look for a scapegoat? Why is it that they lack a desire to act on critical thinking rather than take everything on surface value? Because I think that it would solve a lot of issues, not just with regards to our current political climate, but also having knee-jerk reactions in relationships where if somebody says something, you don't take into consideration the context of their words, but just the fact that they said something offensive and you want to react to that. Likewise, in politics, Wayne LaPierre and Trump want to get on the TV screen and say, oh, it's violent video games that are the cause, without taking into consideration the legislature, the loopholes, and the accessibility for high-power assault weapons available in this country. So my question to you is, to the best of your knowledge, considering your atheist background, why is it that people rush to look for a scapegoat rather than employing critical thinking skills?
Can I chew on that for a second and answer it kind of here on the air? I mean, give me a second to digest that. Man. Yeah. All right. I appreciate you very much. Thanks for the call.
Of course.
It's probably a question better posed to a psychologist. I did a speech last year that talked about how in the era of fake news online, false, bogus headlines, it's hard to differentiate between what's real and what's not. But people often rush to share these things because it speaks to kind of a perhaps moral panic sometimes within us, a desire for justice, a desire to do what is right. And so we don't read past the first three sentences. We don't vet the content. We don't seek corroborating articles. We don't see if they've been debunked by Snopes or other fact-checking entities. We just go, oh, God, that's insane. And we share it with everybody we know. And I think, there's a book by Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist. It's called The Righteous Mind. And it talks about this desire for goodness and justice to prevail. And how in the Twitterverse, in the age of the internet, when we are only digesting the first three sentences of any story, when we only see the headline, when we're not going a lot deeper, we've become more and more conditioned for a desire for binary answers, easy cookie-cutter answers that solve all the problems. This is something that human beings want. We don't want to see a messy answer that doesn't fix all the problems. Imperfection is, it doesn't get us there. So when you see the wildly complex universe that we live in, and we see all of the different factors that might play into why someone does what they do, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's shooting up a school, whether it's ISIS, whether it's whatever. They want a pat answer. They want it to fit right here in a byline. It's got to fit in 280 characters on Twitter, and if it doesn't, they don't have any time of the day for it. I think that atheists are not immune from this. I used to think we were. I think we're human beings, and it's hard. It's hard for us to stop, take a breath, and go deep into complex issues. Why people carry out violence is a hugely complex issue. Everybody coming from a different background. Who are they? What do their mental process look like? Are they damaged in some way? Have they been conditioned by a hate group? Is it Trump? Is it a gun culture? Is it a combination of 50, 75 other things all playing into that? Where do they live? How do they operate? What do they think? How do their friends and family think? What's their surroundings doing to condition them to be what they are? Are they just hideous, awful human beings? People who are always going to land on the wrong side, who are always going to be hateful, awful, destructive human beings, detriments to society. And how does that work? And man, the Twitterverse doesn't have any time for this. They want a scapegoat. And so video games, look, it's a 2-word answer. Or violent video games, 3-word answer that now solves all of the problems for me. It now has taken this complex thing and it's made it simple. It's something I can chew on. It's something I can digest. It's something that we don't have to think too much about. People want a scapegoat. The scapegoat is a distraction because and I don't want to get too political in this particular broadcast, but if the rhetoric that Trump is spewing from the White House is indeed fueling the fires of hatred, and I believe that it is very strongly, for the people who are supporters of that administration, it's not in their interest to talk about Donald Trump. It's not in their interest to talk about hateful rhetoric. It's not in their interest to talk about inflammatory language spoken from the highest office in the United States by arguably the most powerful person in the country. It's not in their interest to be honest about that kind of thing. And so instead of getting into, language matters, words matter, you are fueling these fires of hatred and division and unrest, and someone out there is just going to take what you say and they're going to run with it. And there's a responsibility that comes with that. Rather than have that conversation, you just look over there and go, wait, video games. Oh, it's the moral decay of society. Oh, we don't pray enough. Oh, remember after 9/11, right? After the violent attacks of September 11th, where the buildings had fallen, the towers had fallen, the Pentagon was on fire, United 93 had already crashed into the ground. And who was it? It was Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and their ilk who were talking about how it was our embracing of abortion and homosexuals that caused this tremendous, tremendous tragedy. And it's because God removed his hand of protection against us. So now it's the gays and abortion, gays and abortion, gays and abortion. People are... they're not looking at the problem. It's easier to come over here and look at the distraction. It's a lot easier to do that than to look and to say, where is God? What is God? Is there a God? What kind of God? How could God? These are the tough questions. And the other distractions help to keep you from focusing on the real issues at hand. I just totally vamped that answer. I'm just, off the cuff. I'm sure it deserves a much more consideration by a much more honed mind than mine. I don't know. It's something you can talk about a little bit in the comments section. An international call on Skype 52. You're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. Hi, who's this?
Hi, Seth. This is Jose. Long-time listener.
Oh, what's going on, Jose? What's on your mind?
Caller.
What do you think?
I don't know. People might be interested in an outsider's perspective, but the El Paso shooting hit particularly close to home, not just because the asshole was targeting Mexicans, but because I grew up along the border and I know what living along the border is like. You know, you go across to, I don't know, Eagle Pass, El Paso, McAllen, Brownsville, Nogales, wherever, and you know, you shop there. You shop for groceries, you go to the movies, you go to the malls, and the fact that it could have been someone that I care about. He said that he was targeting Mexicans, and he drove from Dallas to El Paso. It wasn't just someone from El Paso who went, you know, as they say, postal. You know, he consciously made several choices to target people. I agree with a lot of what people have been saying about scapegoating gamers. Because I don't know about you, but I haven't ripped out anyone's spine just because I played Mortal Kombat at one time.
I guess that did happen in that game, didn't it? Yeah. It's just...
Yeah, and someone else mentioned David Pagman, and yet he had on a psychologist, was it yesterday or the day before? There are a lot of people that come to mind. For example, Tom Nichols was on Bill Maher earlier tonight, and he wrote an article in 2015 about Dylan Roof and the Lost Boys. Young people who either because they're white supremacists or they're incels or they were bullied in high school or whatever. And whatever the reason is, it comes down to how easy it is to get a gun. You can probably count the number of mass shootings made by civilians. I mean, not counting the one made due to cartel violence or organized crime. You can count the number of school shootings or mall shootings or any type of shooting in Mexico in one hand with fingers to spare. And it's usually a kid with a semi-automatic pistol or a shotgun, or people don't have access to semi-automatic rifles or bump stocks or anything like that. So you usually get someone with a semi-automatic pistol with 7 rounds in the magazines and one in the chamber. And the last one is usually used by the shooter to kill himself. You cannot get an AR-15 in Mexico just by going downtown or going to our version of Wal-Mart or a real Mexican Wal-Mart. So, Republicans blame everything and anyone they can except how easily it is to get a gun. It should be as hard to get a gun as it is to have a pilot's license.
We'll let the chat room talk about that just a little bit, and we kind of see where everybody takes that. But thanks for the call. Greatly appreciated, my friend.
Thank you.
All right,
enjoy your weekend.
You know, it's interesting. People hear that I'm a firearms owner. I've got a couple of pistols. Target shoot occasionally. I do have one. You know, I mean, it's in a gun safe with a quick release. And I've made the declaration that I, to a degree, keep it for home protection. I don't think about it. I don't walk around like, well, hell, if someone going to break into my house, I'm going to shoot them. Right. Which is a lot of people who have that, you know, there's almost a bravado to the way they talk about it. When someone comes into my house and they threaten my family, I'm just going to take them out of the gene pool right now. That's how it usually goes. But there's almost a pride to the way they talk about it. It's this sort of toxic masculine thing, this performance they probably learned from the culture they were raised in. I'm grieved at the idea that I would ever have to use violence against somebody to protect my family. God, I would never want to do that. I'd never welcome that. I would be shattered. I would be, for the rest of my life, scarred by what had happened. If I had to, you know, if someone came in for the purpose of violence or harm to me or my family, and I had to use potentially lethal force against them, I would. But I'm not happy about it. I'm also one of those guys who is a properly trained and licensed firearms owner who hates the National Rifle Association and thinks it's a gun cult, who doesn't think that anybody should have an AR-15 who is not in the military or part of law enforcement. I just don't think that there's any reason for civilians to own those weapons. And people don't process that because, again, we're back to binary thinking. You're either pro-gun, which means all gun, or you're anti-gun, which means no guns. The idea that you can see that there are a lot of peace-loving, pacifist firearms owners in the United States and elsewhere around the world. They hate violence. They may own a firearm, but they hate violence. They don't hunt. They don't want to see other people harmed, especially at the end of a gun. And they despise the NRA, but they also own firearms. I mean, in the minds of some people, these two things cannot exist. And it's because they're operating or analyzing it from a binary model. It's frustrating to try to have a conversation about that kind of thing. But, the NRA, they've got this weird God and guns mentality. And they're very cult-like. If you've seen their promo videos, Dana Lesh is no longer making those videos, thank goodness. But they're very much fear-pimping this apocalyptic future where they're coming for your guns. And now, as they turn an hourglass on screen, now your time is running out, which is an implied threat. The NRA is bleeding members. The NRA is bleeding support. I could not be happier. I want to see that organization go extinct so bad I can taste it. Let's do one more. 6-4, you're on the Thinking Atheist podcast. Who's this?
Kelvin, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for calling, my friend.
Thanks for putting me on. I'm an old Facebook friend of yours, although I've never spoken to you in person.
To talk to you.
I'm calling from Christchurch, New Zealand, where it's about 20 to 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. So we're a wee bit ahead of you guys.
Christchurch, I'm sure you've got a dog in this fight then after you've been listening to some of this conversation. What's your perspective on all of it?
Oh, big time. I have so many rhetorical questions to ask, but only limited time.
Take your time.
Especially seeing as, from my point of view, I mean, I came within about 2 minutes of the terrorist down here in his shoot up of the second mosque. I happen to work as a firefighter down here, and we just happened to be driving past the second mosque on the way out to do some training for the afternoon. We had no idea that the first shooting was underway, let alone the second. And when we wound back the time, we only beat him past the second mosque by around about 2 minutes.
My goodness! So
it does give you an interesting perspective. Not to mention a few questions about American culture. I think you started out this whole conversation about the video games. I suppose it should be considering the position of your president, the tangerine toddler, as I like to call him.
The tangerine, what'd you say? The tangerine twat waddler?
No, the tangerine toddler.
Oh, because I heard tangerine twat muffin, or there's a whole series of tangerine descriptives for the man.
They're all interchangeable.
Yeah, you can sort of splice. Forgive the interruption. You must look across the ocean at us and wonder if we've collectively lost our minds, right?
Oh, big time. But that having been said, I still have a fascination and genuine love for American culture. In fact, I'm going to be in the United States day after tomorrow. I'm coming into LA and spending 5 weeks over in your country, as well as Mexico. So I hope they let me in back over the border once I've been there.
I think
and I don't wind up.
We like to bitch and moan about how bad we've got it, but as bad as things get and as insane as things are, I look at much of the rest of the world and I'm still thankful to be here, and I'm still wanting to try to fix the problems from within. Tell me, I know Australia had a big roundup of the weapons where they were voluntarily turned in. I think someone earlier in the broadcast said they were confiscated by the Australian government, and that's not accurate. I think they were actually voluntarily or semi-voluntarily surrendered, and the gun owners were compensated, and they got, I don't know how many weapons out of the country, and their crime decreased. In New Zealand, can you tell me about the culture there? Are there weapons of any kind?
Oh, yeah. You're absolutely correct, on both in the case of Port Arthur and down here in New Zealand. And the contrast couldn't be more stark between here and the United States, because there's barely been a whimper about all this, because I think people in general realize that when someone uses one of these weapons, which are really designed with no other purpose than to kill other human beings, well, technically wound them. One of the things I did before I joined the fire brigade here was I spent 10 years as a soldier in my country's army, and the fact is, with United Nations rated semi-automatic military-style weapons, they're designed to actually wound rather than kill. The idea being that it takes not one but four people to drag a wounded person off the battlefield. So that gives you a mentality about why these weapons were designed in the first place. But there's been very little said. I think down here, people accept that there's not a huge hoopla of protest about the fact that these things are being brought back. There's obviously a few things to be worked around, but
in New Zealand, what do the gun laws look like for you? What can and can you not do?
Okay, well, for starters, to own any firearm, you need to have a firearms license. That would be like a bolt action or a shotgun. In order to own a pistol, you have to have not only a firearms license in which you have to get a police background check done with somebody who knows you, but you also have to register at a local gun club, show 6 months permanent attendance, and undergo another police check in order to be granted what's called a permit to procure, and that allows you to go down to buy your own pistol, because otherwise you just have to use the pistols on site at the range. Beyond that, you've also got collectors and movie prop type weapons which have to be disabled in some way so that they can't fire. But as far as the military style semi-automatics go, they're all coming off they've all been ruled illegal and are being brought back. So anyone who chooses to retain them, unless you have an exemption for things like pest control, will be operating them illegally.
And the public didn't...
It's quite heavily regulated compared to you.
Lose their minds.
No,
you guys didn't have anarchy. And more importantly, you didn't see the government. Like around here, some of the arguments for having all these weapons are, well, what happens if the greatest government in the world turns against its own people and we have to rise up against it? And of course, I'm thinking to myself, good luck with that.
I've seen the video footage of that lone hero standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square when the tank came on down the road, and I think it would be a lot like that. I can't imagine anyone, regardless of how many rounds they've got in their AK-47, being able to compete with a drone or an M1 Abrams or anything of that kind of thing.
Drawing the conversation back to video games, do you have a thought about the video game violence, and does it correlate to the real world?
I'd be repeating the views of many of your viewers and saying I don't think there's any correlation. I mean, it's probably quite a fortunate thing that your president doesn't know what he's talking about when he blames video games. I quite enjoy. I don't really get into shoot 'em up first person type stuff. I'm more into things like SimCity and Civilization 6. But within Civilization 6, I've started my fair share of thermonuclear wars. So I guess it's quite fortunate that I don't have access to that kind of weaponry, or else I probably would have nuked Australia by now.
And Sid Meier would be proud, probably, I'm sure, if he heard that you were using the full aspect of the game, the full potential of the game. That's awesome.
Indeed. To pop in one last witty comment before I no doubt have to close, I suppose, with regards to that theory on the part of your politicians over there, I would have to defer to my number one intellectual hero, the late, great Christopher Hitchens, in paraphrasing an interview he did with Sean Hannity over the death of Jerry Falwell, in saying that with regards to Mr. Trump, I think that if you gave that man an enema, you could bury him in a matchbox.
I appreciate you, brother. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for calling. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
You know, I'm regret when I was down in Australia for the Unholy Trinity tour that I didn't go down to New Zealand. I wish I had. It was already a 2-week trip. It was hard to take much more time. But I kind of wish I'd seen New Zealand. Just an amazing place, you know. One day I will return. Well, one day I'll go back down. Let me finish out this conversation with a quick heads up. My speaking tour is going to 2 stops in Michigan next month. And you are invited. Going to be in Grand Rapids, September the 11th, just outside of Detroit, September the 12th. Looks like a potential event going to happen in my hometown of Tulsa in October with R and Raw. The first weekend of November, I'll be in Orlando, Florida. And then Matt Dillahunty and myself in Phoenix on November the 9th. All the details are at my website, sethandrews.net/events. Take care of yourself. I will see you back here next time. Have a great week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.